We're going to get started. My name is Nick Rocky. I'm the Managing Director of Trilog. We'd like to welcome you to this webinar on climate change and COP26. Trilog is a business that focuses on the interaction between business and society. And on the eve of COP26, the business response to climate change has never been more pertinent. So we're delighted to be hosting this short webinar and research series. And it comprises of 2 surveys with business leaders, 2 webinars, one pre and one post COP26, a workshop and a research paper. So the intention of the series is to gather and share information on how the issue of climate change is understood and responded to by business. And the particular is on the role of directors and executives in driving this response. The first survey, you're going to have the results shared with you this morning. We're undertaking this initiative in partnership with the Sustainability Institute and the IODSA, Institute of Directors of South Africa. So you'll hear from Jess Schulschenk this morning from the Sustainability Institute, who's providing you with a bit of a contextual overview on the topic, and from Vakeshni Vandar from the Institute of Directors, who will close the session a bit later on. I'm going to hand over now to Nicole Martins. Nicole is supporting Trilog as an associate consultant. She is a development economist with a special focus on innovative finance and the integration of ESG factors into investment processes. She's currently the acting head of the Principles for Responsible Investment, the PRI for Africa and the Middle East. So Nicole, over to you.
Thanks very much, Nick, and good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. Nick has given you the background as to sort of what the background that lead up to these sessions. I'm going to take you just quickly through the agenda for today and a bit of housekeeping, and then we'll hand over to our first speaker, which will be Jess Schulschenk, to take us through the basics. So just as to kick off the session today, we're going to have a very brief recap of the science of climate change, specifically looking at what is actually happening and how is it manifesting in Africa, with a focus always on what does this mean for business on the continent and specifically in South Africa. After that, we'll have a closer look at the impacts of climate change on business in terms of risks and opportunities, and we'll zoom in on the findings of the survey that Nick mentioned around the awareness of and engagement with climate-related issues by South African directors and business leaders. That will set us up for a panel discussion with some business leader representatives, including Teresa Ramchut from Old Mutual, Sanjeev Rugba from ShopRite Holdings, and Paul Jorgensen, who's an independent sustainability advisor working with corporates on their climate response. We will run the panel session a little bit differently to what you might be used to. We'll let the panelists each do a couple of opening remarks for a few moments, and then we will go into a discussion session. When we get to that point, or as we're going through the presentations that lead up to the discussion, please feel free to drop any questions that you've got into the Q&A box or into the chat, and we will have the panelists or the speakers that have presented previously address those during the discussion in the Q&A portion. And then we aim to wrap up and close by 10:30. If the discussion does seem like it's getting a lot of engagement and we're going to need more time, we can always address some of your questions over email at a later stage. We can direct it to some of our speakers. For the basics, please keep your video off during the presentations and your microphones. If you would like to ask a question verbally, you can raise that in the chat during the discussion portion of the session, and then we will unmute you so that you can join us for that. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Jess, who's going to share slides from her side and take us through a quick overview of just the science of climate change so that we understand the relevance and the urgency of the situation in this market. Thanks so much, Jess.
Wonderful. Thanks, Nicole. So I'm just going to share from my side, and I hope to share with you in about 10 minutes the climate science as it's unfolding today, what the science means for business, and really a very condensed overview of some of the big issues. We'll share with you after this webinar some more resources. So if you've got more questions, if there's more things you want to understand about this, there's a lot of resources that we'll share and point you to. I think as a departure point, this image is so important to me because it's a critical reminder that even though we live in an incredibly connected, fast-paced, probably we would all say increasingly vulnerable, volatile, rapidly changing world, we live on this one world. We have one planet, and that's not some kind of green agenda, that's not some radical worldview, it's really just the science of it, the fact. We have this one place that we get to call home. And yet, over the last 50, 70 years, the world has changed quite fundamentally. But our business models, our economic systems, whilst they're a lot more intense, they're a lot more far-reaching, they haven't really made some of the deep and fundamental shifts to accommodate what is becoming the new normal. And I think it's important for us to have a look at how the world today is fundamentally, has many more people. We're using a lot more energy. The energy that we use is fossil fuels. And so I always say fossil fuels by themselves are not good or bad, they just are what they are. But when we, over the last 100 years, we've used a lot of it at a rate far greater than the Earth has the ability to assimilate the impacts of. And the main impact that we see from this is something called the production of greenhouse gases. So carbon dioxide is one of those gases. There's many others, methane, nitrous oxide. But when we track the increase in greenhouse gases, it's at an unprecedented scale. And linked to that is what we are seeing, not in the future, but really unfolding right now, which are important trends around what we're calling global warming. So an average increase in surface temperature. This is obviously part of a much bigger set of trends. And so this is what has been termed by many researchers the great acceleration. We are more people using a lot more stuff, and that has an impact on the world today. Whether it's around global warming, the loss of ecosystem services, these are all deeply interconnected and they reinforce and affect each other. I think what's important to point out here shortly as well is that it's kind of that rule of 80-20. So about 20% of the world's population are responsible for using over 80% of the world's resources. Many of the questions around climate change, and specifically in the South African context, also bring up a lot of questions around social justice. Those who contributed least to the problem are often those most vulnerable to the impacts of the effects that we're starting to see. So I'm going to just take a moment to explain what kind of in the sciences we talk about as the greenhouse effect. And again, it's not to villainize greenhouse gases, they're actually really important. These greenhouse gases that form a part of the Earth's system, the atmosphere, help us to keep of the sun's energy in the atmosphere. So without them, we would burn to death during the day, the sun would be too hot, we wouldn't be protected from it, but we would also probably freeze to death at night. So greenhouse gases are a good thing. The problem is we've increased the concentration of greenhouse gases to the extent that we are trapping too much of the sun's energy within our atmosphere system. And the effect of that is what we talk about here as global warming. Now, I wish I could say that means more beach days. We're definitely seeing the UK starting to produce wine in ways that they've never done before. But the reality is where climate change or climate crisis is manifesting as extreme weather variability. So we're seeing droughts and flooding, extreme heat, extreme cold. It's unpredictable. It's very hard to be able to say at a local level exactly what's going to unfold. But many of our economic systems, if we think about agriculture, if we think about transport and logistics, the ways that we've built cities, has been in a very stable climatic period. And we're now entering into an unstable climatic period. I won't go into this in a lot of detail. We'll share these with you afterwards if it's of interest. But the predominant driver of greenhouse gas emissions is by and large the energy that we use. It's not the only one, but it's really, we need to think about how do we move towards a low carbon future? How do we move away from fossil fuels towards other sources of energy, energy efficiency? And how do we do that in a just way so that we're thinking about jobs, security, resilience as well? So one of the things that came up from the survey that Nicole will share with you shortly is that the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is talking about something called a 1.5 degree scenario. And many people in business are not necessarily familiar or comfortable with some of the science that's coming out. So as a bit of background, the IPCC has been a panel that's been going for a long time, really bringing together globally the world's best scientists, a lot of rigorous research. So their findings are incredibly credible, and it's what we take as guidance. What the IPCC is telling us is that at this point, climate change is inevitable. What we have within the next 9 years, we're in what's been called the decade of action. We need to take really decisive action, is both the need and the opportunity to make fundamental changes in order to limit warming. So warming is part of our reality, but we want to make sure that we're not warming at rates that will create very, very unstable living conditions. So if we just look at these projections, our current policies put us in a 2.7 to about a 3.1 warming degree scenario. And I'll show you just now some of the research which says how unbearable those conditions start to look. So what we're aiming for is to reduce carbon emissions to the extent that we can maintain a 1.5 degree warming. We know it's going to get warmer, but we're trying to limit how warm it actually gets. And so this is calling for immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And Nicole will talk about some of this from a business perspective. Basically, the call to action is that we need to halve global emissions by 2030, and we need to reach net zero by 2050. So that is, it's radical, but it's also necessary. If we have a look here, just really briefly at the difference between what is a 1.5 degree scenario. So that's considerably, that is already a bit warmer than what we see now. If you look at Africa, you'll see that we're largely affected. What we're trying to avoid is getting into 2 or 4 degree scenarios where we actually enter into what is considered unlivable hot zones, forcing mass migration and the shutdown of many sectors potentially. Also, we see that this affects rainfall. There's concerns around rising sea levels. I'll kind of show you a bit of an overview of what this means in the South African context, but the ramifications are extensive. So unfortunately, we don't have time to get into a lot of this in detail. I think if you cast your eye over, we know if you're in the agricultural sector, you have been working and thinking on these issues for some time. We know that if you're in banking, you're aware that the agricultural sector has been working and thinking on this. We're seeing those in the insurance sector have been very concerned about what the implications will be for large-scale infrastructure. So there's really real and immediate impacts from the environmental side. But I think what we really equally, if it's inextricable, we can't separate the social concerns. And so I find this image from World Economic Forum, the Global Risk Report, very helpful, so that we see that climate action failure is deeply connected and reinforces a number of global risks, many of which we're seeing unfolding in the South and the African context in general. So the erosion of social cohesion, livelihood crises, if you think about the unemployment rates that we're seeing, debt crises, biodiversity loss. And so we find ourselves as part of this intricate web where you tug at one string and it has a ripple through the system. But what we're starting to see is not only is climate a significant one of those threads, it actually has ripples that are affected and reinforced by many other threads, some of them social, some financial, but all deeply interconnected. And so the call for action to business is to reduce emissions to within that halving by 2030, carbon neutral by 2050. And where one is unable to reduce, to then look at offsetting opportunities. So we need to think about how we are reinvesting in our ecological infrastructure. The global kind of equatorial forests are like the lungs of the planet. And the Amazon rainforest, for example, this year has become a net carbon emitter because we have destroyed so much of the forest, which we absolutely rely on in order to sequestrate, absorb that carbon. The other aspect, so we talk here about mitigating, reducing the contribution to the problem. The other aspect that we're looking at is adaptation. How do we start to live and respond to these changing contexts? So that's a lot of information in a short amount of time. I hope it gives you a bit of an overview, some of the key terminology. And what we'll share with you is some resources to have a look at that will help you to deepen your understanding on these issues as well. Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you very much, Jess. So we appreciate that it is a lot of information that we need to get through in a short time, but we're hoping that that gives everyone, like you say, just a background, cover the basics of what it is that we're talking about at this stage. I'm going to share my screen. We can get back into it here. Can everyone see my screen again? Right. Yes. So perfect. Thanks, Matthew. So thank you, everyone, again. So we know that was a whirlwind sort of tour through the science, but it's really important, I think, and Jess emphasized the fact that this change, this sort of global adaptation or evolution that's happening to the biophysical limitations that we're facing, it is happening now. It's not something that might happen. There's no question about it anymore. It's very real and it's very urgent that we need to do something. And that's not just as individuals and sort of the way that we live our lives. It's really as business, how we operate, how do we design the systems that we use every day to support our sort of socioeconomic survival on the planet. So again, what we've got now is another short zoom in on what's this mean for business. So you understand now that there's a lot of science that's happening. There's going to be some real physical changes to the planet. And obviously, as Jess mentioned, for some sectors, that's very direct, very palpable. So in agriculture, if it doesn't rain, it has a very real and immediate effect on your business. But it affects everyone throughout the value chain because, as you mentioned, we are all connected. So we're going to have a look at what does this actually mean for business? How do we think about it? And we'll use this as an opportunity as well to have a look at the results of the survey that we conducted, having a look at what is the sort of engagement with this issue that South African business leaders are currently reporting. A reminder that if you do have questions, you can throw them into the Q&A or into the chat, and we'll deal with them in the discussion portion. So just as a reminder, so building on what Jessa talked to us about, is that in response to the physical changes that the planet is undergoing, the world as we know it and the way that it operates is currently in transition. We are moving away from socioeconomic systems that were extractive and exploitative towards those that are more sustainable and inclusive. And the private sector, and especially the financial services sector, plays a critical role in that transition as an enabler of the transition activities that need to happen. For business, the risks that are presented by climate change are both physical, as we mentioned, and transitional. So what do we mean by that? So we've talked about the physical risk, which is, for example, if you're in agriculture, it doesn't rain, it directly impacts your output. If you're an insurer and you have to pay out increasingly claims against extreme weather events, that affects your bottom line and your stability. The transitional aspect is a little bit more nuanced, and that's really focused on, in a nutshell, whether your business will still be here in the new normal. So as we make this transition to more sustainable, inclusive systems, to low carbon economies, to sort of greener or more responsible businesses, if you are not making those changes at pace, your business will be left behind. And we can talk a little bit more about that when we get into our panel discussion. Policymakers and regulators are responding increasingly with disruptive interventions in capital market functioning. We see that all over the world. We see that with the evolving understanding of fiduciary duty from a financial services perspective around intervention in market functioning in the form of things like taxonomies, which you might have heard of. The taxonomy is really just a classification system of what kinds of projects are considered to be green or sustainable or responsible and which are not. And we've seen increasingly these taxonomies have been introduced into markets to guide not only investors, but project developers, so businesses in these sectors, around what do we now consider to be an acceptable standard of operation. The EU has the most developed one so far, but there are plenty in different markets, including a draft taxonomy available in South Africa at the moment. So it's something that is happening. Policymakers and regulators are increasingly recognizing that the shift that we need to make, and it's part of the commitments that governments have made to things like the Paris Agreement. You've heard us talk a bit about COP, and we can talk about that a bit more in the panel discussion. It's a big conference, the climate change conference that's happening this year. It happens every year. This year, it's a very big deal for a couple of reasons. The first one is that it was skipped last year because of the pandemic. So the expectations are very high this year that there'd be even more to report since everyone's had a bit of extra time. It's also the conference where we're expecting governments to announce increased ambition when it comes to cutting their carbon emissions. So we're expecting a lot of governments to have really ambitious plans around net zero by 2050 or earlier. And it's also the first time that the private sector, and specifically financial services, have not only been included in the conversation, but in fact challenged to lead the discussion. So there's a lot of private sector initiatives that have also come out leading up to COP26 that are really focusing on companies in the private sector taking a lead and saying, what are your targets? How are you going to contribute to this? And policymakers and regulators are responding to the commitments that they've made, realizing that they're not going to meet those targets unless they intervene in the way that markets function. So we're seeing increased disclosure requirements, corporate governance requirements and stewardship codes. We're seeing, as I mentioned, this evolution of fiduciary duty. We're seeing these things like taxonomies, sustainable finance strategies, including here in South Africa where there is, and then obviously through IODSA, most recently with the King guidance that's been provided on the responsibility of business leaders when it comes to integrating climate change into your business strategy. So whichever way you turn, it's really important that you get to grips with these issues, because it's not a nice to have, it's in every way a requirement of a business leader in this country and globally to understand and address these issues. And if that top-down pressure wasn't enough, the bottom-up pressure is also growing. We're seeing increasing market demand for responsible business, right? We're seeing the consumers, the customers at the end of the day are much more discerning, they're much more educated. As Jess mentioned, we live in this sort of increasingly connected world where your consumers are increasingly putting pressure on you to act in a more responsible way and also to be very transparent about what it is you're doing, how you make your decisions. And if that wasn't enough, so if the policy intervention wasn't enough and the market demand from the bottom wasn't enough, there's also increasingly evidence around the financial materiality of sustainable or responsible business. We have increasing evidence that shows us that businesses that effectively integrate material, environmental, social, and governance issues into the way that they operate are businesses that outperform financially, which is exactly what you want as an investor. So it means that you need to be thinking about this from an investment lens as well. What's very clear and what we know for a fact is that the need to act is urgent. It's not something that you can put off anymore. One of the things that Jess mentioned and that you'll hear a lot about probably in the panel discussions, but also in the news lately and in the lead up to COP26 and coming out of COP26 is the idea of a net zero commitment, which is really about minimizing your emissions, so trying to get them neutral and then offsetting what you can't completely erase. And we've seen a lot of commitments, not just by governments, by countries, but also including South Africa, but also by big companies around the world, including one or two in South Africa, but not a great number, to reduce their emissions in this way. And again, the impact is felt across the value chain, right? Because as a company, if I make that commitment, I cannot actually achieve it unless the value chain that I interact with is also on that same path. So again, it's something that you'll start to see affecting businesses across the value chain, across different sectors very soon. I do see there are some messages coming in the chat, and we'll get to those, I promise. So let's have a look at the survey. So we understand that the science is very clear. This is happening. We know that this is going to have very real impacts for business. So how are we doing as South African businesses, taking IODSA members who participate in this survey as a bit of a proxy? So for this survey, we had 177 responses. More than 80% were directors, board members, and senior executives. So definitely high level, top level decision makers. And almost 75% were in financial services, or the other sort of category, which was majority dominated by professional services, so advisory and consulting services. We also had more than half of the respondents represented JSE listed or medium to large cap companies. So generally, for this survey, we had a good representation of top level decision makers across critical industries and impactful businesses in terms of the sheer scale and size of those businesses. So that's who was answering the survey, just to keep in mind as we go forward. And the findings are not great when it comes to awareness of some of the key concepts, so that Jess had touched on and that we'll discuss a bit in the panel discussion coming up. The awareness levels are not great. So what we can see is that 40% of the respondents do not feel comfortable to explain the causes of global warming. So hopefully Jess's presentation helped a little bit with that. But if it is something that you're struggling with, there are so many sources of information to actually just make sure you have that understanding. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us after this. We can help you with that. Almost 80% couldn't comfortably explain what we're talking about when we mention these 1.5 versus 2 versus 4 degree scenarios. Such a critical component of understanding your business strategy is understanding how these different scenarios will affect your business, so that you know whether your business will even continue to exist in a 2 degree or a 4 degree world. We've got 44% that are not comfortable to explain the climate risks faced by their own industry. So that's also a concern. As I mentioned, it's 100% material and part of your responsibility as a business leader to understand how this risk will manifest in your industry so that you can appropriately address that. And so to not be able to even discuss what those risks might be for your business is a really big red flag. Also, we've got this 75% can't explain the concept of stranded assets. Stranded assets, which we'll touch on in the panel, is really important, especially considering that the vast majority of our respondents are in financial services, which is really where this sits. Because you're the one that will be stuck holding a stranded asset. But also from an issuer side, it's really important that you don't become a stranded asset. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. More than half can't explain a low carbon future, and 2/3 cannot explain what carbon offsetting is. So Jess had mentioned that as well, carbon offsetting, which is really when you can't minimize your emissions anymore, but you can offset them by investing in a program that is a net negative emitter. So we'll talk a little bit about that as a strategy too. And then, of course, it's also quite worrying that such a low percentage of the respondents understand the just transition. So what's very clear from the survey, from this very small sample, again, which we take as a proxy for sort of a snapshot of business leaders in South Africa, is that there's an urgent need for capacity development amongst business leaders. These are some of the key concepts that you don't need to be an expert in, but you absolutely need to have a comfort level to discuss these and specifically to understand these in the context of your business in order for you to have a viable strategy to address these issues going forward. Looking at some of the initiatives that are ongoing, that's also really interesting to have a look at. I'd mentioned the Green Finance Taxonomy earlier, which as I noted is really a classification system. It's a handbook for you as an investor or as a business around what should my operations look like in order for them to be considered sustainable. And less than 8% of our respondents were even aware that the taxonomy exists. That's something that is definitely worth building your capacity on, because it is quite literally the tick box you need to follow in order to receive investment or to give investment. Also, only 10% are aware of South Africa's nationally determined contributions. So those are the targets we set as a nation that we announced at COP as part of our commitment as South Africa to the Paris Agreement. And they guide the energy or the emissions budget for the entire country. So whatever sector you're in, you're bound by those. So it's really important that you understand what that strategy looks like and how you can fit within it. Also, less than 20% are aware of National Treasury's Sustainable Finance Initiative. So 2 years ago, National Treasury of South Africa released a paper called Financing a Sustainable Economy. It's a strategy for sustainable finance across the market, across the country. And in there, it included recommendations around things like the development of the taxonomy, which has now come to fruition. It included recommendations on mandatory reporting around climate risk, specifically along the TCFD framework, which we'll touch on in the panel. It included recommendations around capacity and competency building for business leaders, specifically those in financial services. It talked to the development of sustainable finance tools and platforms. And from that, we saw the JSE develop their sustainability segment. So that document and that strategy, which is a living document, is being updated quite regularly and is available on the Treasury website, is really a guiding document for how the South African economy, at least from a financing perspective, is addressing this issue. It is absolutely in your interest as a business leader in South Africa to understand that document because it affects how you receive or disperse financing. And then, of course, about a third of the respondents are aware of COP26. So that I would have hoped would be higher, since in the invitation to participate in the survey, we actually explained what COP26 was. But it also shows you that we're actually more aware of what's happening globally than we are of what's happening in our own backyard, which is, I think, a failing on our part. It's something that we could definitely do better at. And here, so what are we doing? So that was, we were looking at the awareness levels, and now we're going to have a look quickly at the integration. So how are businesses actually integrating climate-related risks into their business strategy? And what we find is that almost 2/3 of our respondents said that they have no integration, minimal integration, or compliance-driven integration, which is not great, right? It's sort of the bare minimum that you can do. At the same time, given the slide that we'd seen earlier about the need for capacity development, despite that, only about a third of our respondents, just over a third of the respondents actually said they have no approach at the moment of building their capacity in this regard. So they've got no plan for how to make sure business leaders or employees within the business understand these issues. Coupled with that, there was quite a high percentage of respondents who stated that they just expect business leaders, particularly directors, to be aware of these things, to be educated on these things, and they don't think that it's something that they should have to actively manage. So that's a really interesting dynamic. And then TCFD, which I mentioned and which we'll touch on in the panel, is currently being used. It's a really useful tool for understanding the risks your business face and plotting your strategy going forward. It's currently in use by less than 8% of the respondents that we got participated in this survey. So what this suggests is that we are at risk right now as corporate South Africa of doing the bare minimum whilst failing to invest in our capacity to do any more than that. And that's a concern. So that's sort of where we are. I think it's a snapshot, and I know that I've gone a bit over time. I'm so sorry, it's very bad moderating of myself, but we'll go into the panel discussion now. But really what that should be starting to get going in your mind, at least, is this question of where is my company's leadership on this issue? So where are we in terms of our awareness versus our integration versus our investment in building our capacity, making sure that we actually know what's going on? This is so important. Are we doing all we can? Should we be doing more? And if that is the question that's percolating in your mind, that's fantastic, because now we're going to go into a panel discussion with some business leaders that are on that journey. And we're going to hear a little bit more from them about what it's looked like so far, what they've found to work, where there've been some challenges, and hopefully give you some practical tips on where to start and what tools and resources you might want to look into. So now we're going into our panel discussion. I'll ask my panelists if they wouldn't mind popping their videos on for me as I introduce them. We've got, as I mentioned, we've got Sanjeev, who's the Group Sustainability Manager for ShopRite Holdings. Tarusha, who's joining us from Old Mutual as the ESG and Responsible Investment Analyst, and then Paul, who's an independent sustainability advisor, who's been working with businesses in South Africa on their climate change response for the last couple of years. I'm going to stop sharing my slides so that we can focus on the video for the panel, and then I can also see the chats for now. There we go. All right, so I've got my panelists. What I'd like to do is just start with a quick opening remarks, which really mine is all around reiterating that, you know, this transition is happening. If you want to remain relevant as a business in South Africa or globally, you really need to be, ideally you should have started on this already, but if you haven't, you really need to get going on it as a matter of urgency. Don't wait for increasingly disruptive policy intervention. Don't wait to be told to do it. Don't wait until your customers are asking for it, because by then it is too late. Someone who has been progressive and been on the front foot about it is going to kick you out of the market. It's just so important. So beyond the fact that it's your sort of ethical and moral responsibility to take this into account, it's just good business to understand these things and take it forward. And now we're going to hear a little bit from our panelists about what's got them going on this journey. We'll start with just some intro remarks from each of them, and then I'll start asking some questions, and I'll also peel through the chat to see what kinds of questions have come through there. Tarusha, maybe we can start with you. We know that as an insurer, we know that the insurance sector is particularly vulnerable and particularly progressive when it comes to these things, because we've seen increasing extreme natural disasters and extreme weather events, which affects you directly. But it'd be great to hear a little bit more from you around what's got Old Mutual going on this journey and where you are so far.
Thank you, Nicole. So I think as many of you are aware, Old Mutual is a pan-African business. So we actually operate within 13 different African countries and across 4 different business lines. So that includes life and savings, asset management, property and casualty, as well as banking and lending. So it definitely does pose a myriad of climate change considerations that we need to take into account. And I think definitely interesting from the survey findings was the large portion of respondents within the financial services sector. And I think in a sense, this actually shows sort of an enhanced recognition of the role that the sector itself has to play in terms of combating climate change. So it's no longer just the heavy emitters that are responsible, but also the fiduciaries of capital having significant influence over the deployment of funds. And I think another thing is that it's actually linked to the nature of the industry itself, and that it is a systemic risk. So looking across from a strategic, financial, as well as operational risk perspective, it's definitely something that needs to be integrated into the way in which we do business. And importantly, there's an ultimate impact on the sustainability of the entire organization, as well as the communities and the countries in which we operate. So maybe just to touch on some of the key learnings that we've gained as part of this journey. I think that addressing these kinds of risks has by no means been an easy endeavor, but I think definitely the secret to getting ahead is getting started in this space. So we've actually found that the TCFD framework has been quite useful in this regard. That's a task force on climate-related financial disclosures. And in terms of that, I think the first imperative in relation to the TCFD pillars is definitely looking at whether you have the appropriate governance systems in place. So from our perspective, looking at from a board point of view, at that level, we have our risk committee, as well as our responsible business committee, which are predominantly responsible for managing our climate change accountability. And then through our executive committee, we've actually established a climate change task force. And this task force actually has representation across the business. So it's a multidisciplinary team comprised of individuals with varying skill sets, which is actually really important in having a holistic view of the issues at hand. And then looking at, particularly from a risk point of view, we've seen climate change as having an extensive scale of impact. So it has been also integrated into our risk methodology, as well as our risk management systems and classification framework as well. So the intention of this is actually to drive prioritization within the business and also to inform our relevant responses to the risk. And then to touch on the strategic perspective, so being a business with varying business units, I think we found it quite important to be able to integrate each of those various business strategies together in a coordinated way. So this is essentially just for us to understand where we have the greatest climate impact and where we face the greatest risks. And that essentially then informs our strategic direction. So we actually do this through our responsible business strategy, and this forms part of the overall group strategy. And that's implemented through our Old Mutual Care's strategic pillars. So through this, we're able to coordinate our response to climate change. And for us, what this actually means is that from a strategic integration point of view, it's very much focused on actually embedding those climate risks within our relevant policies and processes, embedding it within the core organizational strategy, and very importantly, ensuring that both the board and management have an understanding of what climate change is and that it is an imperative. And I think it's also key in terms of, looking at developing an integrated climate change material organizational risk framework. And then maybe just to lastly touch on the metrics and targets aspect. So I think a famous statement is that what you can't measure, you can't manage, right? So considering this from our perspective in relation to us as an asset owner, we've actually started the process of baselining our portfolio holdings in respect of their carbon intensity. And this is something that we hope to use to inform our target setting process. So maybe to sum up on that by just saying that business definitely has a material role to play in addressing climate change. And I think it definitely needs to be viewed as a long-term systems level risk. And in addition to that, it's really important that we have these adequate and appropriate governance systems in place, as well as robust risk management frameworks, and all of that underpinned by the strategic foundation that will actually drive the organization's response to climate change as an imperative.
Thanks very much, Trisha. I think there's so much there that I want to follow up on when we get into the discussion. But for the kickoff is really important, I think, for the participants in today's webinar to understand that having a look when you start to examine this issue, you realize very quickly that trying to isolate between environmental, social, and governance issues becomes rather impossible. To Jess's point earlier and to Terusha's, these issues are so complex and interconnected that the only way to do this probably is through a holistic approach and an all-encompassing strategy that looks beyond just sort of which of these factors is going to directly impact me in my bubble, and really looking at what are the broader impacts that this has on environmental and socioeconomic stability, and what does that mean for my business, and how do I help or hinder that process? So it's an expansion of your traditional risk management matrix, really, just looking at it a little bit broader, which is very interesting. And I'm definitely going to ask you later about how you get, especially in an organization the size of Old Mutual, which you've mentioned, it's big and it's a lot of different kinds of businesses, how you make sure that the buy-in and the embedding of this is across that organization. So we'll definitely get into that. Sanjeev, maybe I can turn to you right now and ask, from the perspective of a retailer, which maybe the physical impacts are also very directly impacting your value chain. What's the process been like on your end, and sort of how's this journey been so far in terms of identifying and attempting to address some of the climate risks you face?
Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, I think just by way of introduction, if you don't know much about ShopRite, it's the largest retailer on the African continent, also operating in 13 countries across the continent. Total turnover in the region of about 160 billion rands per annum. Primary brands within the ShopRite stable are ShopRite, Checkers Hyper, USave, OK Furniture, House and Home, CompuTicket, etc. So quite a large stable. I think as a starting point, at the heart of the business is the purpose to be the most affordable, accessible, and innovative retailer on the African continent. And that's an important purpose because a lot of what we do in the organization is embedded into that. If you look at affordability, for us to be affordable, you have to be efficient. And that means then you are using less resources, less energy, less water, and you're also producing less waste. And in that way, you're able to be affordable. Accessible is quite important as well. And just to give you, and to add to what Jess was saying earlier, when the IPCC report came out a couple of months ago, one important aspect, or a few important aspects from there, were the regional fact sheets or regional predictions in terms of what the impacts are going to be. And just to recite some of the impacts in Southern Africa, it's around decreases in mean rainfall, at the same time increases in heavy rainfall and flooding events, increased droughts, increased fire and weather conditions, and increased tropical cyclones. So this is anticipated in a climate which is above 2-degree change. Alarmingly, we're seeing many of that already. I mean, you will know that in the Eastern Cape region has been facing a drought for the last 5 years. You've seen recently the impacts of cyclones coming through Mozambique and in Mpumalanga, and particularly the impact on that on the supply and availability of produce, and in this case, tomatoes. Earlier this year, the price of tomatoes, you'd be aware, was significantly higher because of availability. So when we talk about accessible, our ambition is to have a high on-shelf availability so our customers are able to afford and able to buy and have access to the products that they want. So from a retailer perspective, it has direct implications, or climate change has direct implications in terms of our supply chain, direct and indirect, and then also in terms of our direct operations. So our approach has been twofold, as you saw earlier with what Jess was sharing. On the one side, it's the mitigation, and we approach mitigation on how we are using less energy, or how we can use less energy. So the group has a significant program on energy efficiencies through using LED lighting, for example. Particularly on our logistics side is the routing and the management of our distribution and logistics network. And then also we're looking to review our refrigeration, we call it the refrigeration master plan in our direct operations. At the same time, on the mitigation side, we've embraced the use of renewable energy and renewable electricity, particularly. In our direct operations, we are using solar installations, or we've installed solar installations at more than 45 of our stores across South Africa and Namibia. And we've signed a wheeling agreement, probably one of the biggest in terms of a multi-source to a multi-user agreement in Southern Africa, which will start playing out in the next 5 to 7 years. At the same time, we've also included an adaptation element into our strategy and into our response. So the bulk of our stores have water backup elements and infrastructure, primarily because we know that the impacts of climate change are going to be on the availability and accessibility to water. Supply diversification is also an important element. As I indicated, if you have or are unable to source produce from a certain region, then you potentially have to source it from other regions. COVID has made us maybe a bit more agile in that regard, in sourcing from different suppliers, particularly locally. And at the same time, we are looking at community level resilience and adaptation of the communities that we operate in or that we are part of. It's well established and well known that climate change will have the biggest impact on low-income communities. And these are communities that we operate in. These are communities that our suppliers and our staff and our customers come from. So we're supporting those communities already through initiatives or programs like community-based and household-based food gardens, as well as we have a fleet of mobile soup kitchens that we're able to deploy in the event of any climate emergency or climate disaster. I'll talk a bit about targets and maybe elaborate a bit more on that. We've also, as a group, signed up to a 1.5 degree trajectory, which means we are committing to a net zero by 2050 with a 50% reduction on greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. A lot of the spurring of this or the driver for these activities, I think, around we're acknowledging that there is indeed change to our climate, and we have to be resilient enough to address that. There's a lot of interest from our consumers, from our customers, from investors, from our employees, and from our suppliers as well. The legislative framework is evolving and changing all the time. We know the impacts of the carbon tax, the first phase and the second phase, starting in 2023, are going to certainly have its impact. And then aligning to global frameworks, local and global frameworks like the SDGs as well. And I think the last point I want to make is that it makes business sense to be able to address these impacts, both on the impact side as well as on the opportunity side as well. And if you're operating a business where you are blinkered in terms of what your risks are, what your direct and indirect risks are, then that could potentially be a problem for you.
Thanks very much, Sanjeev. And I think, that's a great way to wrap it up, really, is to say, that in one respect, it's in no way business as usual anymore. But on the other hand, it's completely intuitive and logical way to run your business, right? Is to understand what is affecting us and how are we affecting the broader environment and social and economic factors, and how's that going to destabilize or stabilize things. And I think it's one of those things, again, where when you speak to it like this, it seems, as I said, completely intuitive. It's just good business. And yet it's so different for some businesses to what we've been doing, that it seems completely alien, and like you need some sort of special task force in order to be able to do any justice. So we'll definitely unpack some of how the details of how that's been driven and when we get into the discussion in a little while. And I see some questions that are coming through. Thank you for those. Reminder to keep throwing them in. We're going to get to them in just a moment. Paul, maybe to hand over to you. So these two panelists represent organizations that have obviously made the conscious decision to be really progressive and proactive in their response. But that's not always the case. So it'd be great to hear from you a little bit about your experience around where's this pressure coming from most of the time when businesses do wake up and realize, oh, we need to actually start taking this seriously. Maybe a little bit more about the kind of work that you've been doing and what's been the main levers or the drivers behind identifying and addressing climate risk.
Great, thanks, Nicole. Yes, and I think part of this is about also just reflecting on some of the comments that have been made both by other panel members, but by yourself and Jess. And you touched on the point around what is driving this. And I think in the build up to COP, obviously there's a lot of daily news happening, particularly tagged with climate change, climate policy, climate pledges, climate commitments. And it can become a bit overwhelming. So I think what I see as sort of three key drivers in this space and sort of following the macro level trends. And I think the first one is around the level of policy shift that is happening and how quickly that is happening. I think if we reflect, from a South African context this year, we saw our NDC, so our commitment that we're making to the international community about our emissions, we saw that ambition level increase. I think the community wanted a bit more, but still we moved from somewhere where it went from a very unambitious scenario to something that's a little bit more compatible with a 2-degree scenario. So we saw that happen this year. If we think about the embedded generation limits, that will increase to 100 megawatts, which has enabled businesses to really think about their energy use and shift to renewables. We've also seen municipalities make commitments around procuring 100% from renewables. eThekwini made that commitment where they have a long-term goal about being able to procure from independent power producers, and of that procurement for it to be from renewable energy. We've seen Eskom make big decisions this year around trying to seek green finance. And also when we think around sub-national policy, cities are making these commitments around net zero. Our 5 big metropolitans in the country have all made a net zero commitment, and they've all released climate action plans outlining that pathway around how the city can be a net zero city. So that's just within the South African context. If you think more broadly around all these pledges being made, there's a lot of movement in this space, and that's been happening quite rapidly. I think the second macro trend is this regulation is moving from voluntary to mandatory. And I think there's an element around trying to understand what does that mean? What does a mandatory disclosure on climate change look like? And I think, if we look outside of the borders within the South African context, in the United States market, the Securities Exchange Commission has already called out the inadequate disclosure of climate change, and they're starting to be a little bit more strict about how's that regulated. Similarly, in the European market, with the Sustainable Financial Disclosures Regulation coming out, and we've also seen central banks starting to really understand at a macro level, monetary policy level, how do we understand what climate risk means around monetary policy? And we're starting to see central banks starting to undertake climate stress testing, and the European Central Bank is going to try and do that next year. So it's a space where there's a lot of movement, particularly by the regulators, in trying to fully understand what does climate risk mean in our system, how do we address that risk, and how do we disclose on that risk that enables a commonality to make your decisions based on a common framework. And I think the third macro sort of trend is that climate risks have been realized. You make that point, Nicole, that it's real, it's happening. Yes, it's been happening. And I think for me, what sort of reflecting on the climate policy journey, the first World Conference on Climate Change, I think was in 1979, 42 years ago. It was before I was born, that the global community realized that this is a problem. And it's only now in the last 5 years that we're actually seeing tangible movement in this space. And a lot of that is because climate risks are being realized. There's a physical risk that businesses and governments are starting to actually materially see on their balance sheets. Similarly, around the transition risks and the stranded assets will become a reality within our context. And I think on the transition risk side, it's very interesting. In 2019, there was some research done around what is South Africa's exposure to transition risk. And in that study, they sort of pointed to a figure of $120 billion South Africa exposure to transition risk, of which about 50% has already been realized, and that's largely through our coal sector. But the scary part of that was that of that 120 billion, 75% is beyond the control of the South African government. So we in the global space, we had sort of risk to how our global trade partners respond. And we saw, I think yesterday, China has made a commitment that by 2060, their energy mix will only be 20% coal. And we think around our trade partners, India and China, particularly with our coal, these are really important macro level trends to understand a bit better. So I think we're at this pivotal point, and I think we need to start to sort of say, okay, well, how do we respond? What do we do? I mean, the urgency is there, the risks seem to be there. So how do we actually respond, and what are companies doing, and what do people need to do? And I think there's three key questions, or three responses. And the number one thing that somebody should be doing is asking the right questions. So no matter where you're positioned, particularly if you're in a position of responsibility or a decision maker, you need to be asking the right questions. Are you capacitated enough to ask those right questions? And we saw from the survey results that there's some work to do there around capacitating those that are to be decision makers to ask the right questions. And the number one question that we should be asking ourselves is, what is the risk of silence? So what is the risk of not understanding climate change? What is the risk of not sending out position statements? What is the risk of not going through a process to address the challenges that climate change will face us. So what is the risk of silence versus what is the risk of actually doing something? And I think when you go through that process, and I think the TCFD is a great framework to help you unpack and navigate that decision making. And Teresa touched on the 4 key pillars around understanding governance, understanding the strategy, understanding your risk management, and understanding the targets and metrics that you set. I think the important thing here is the level of credibility in that process. So if you are developing, if you've made a commitment, you're showing leadership, but how credible is your strategy? Does your strategy take into account what a 2-degree scenario means, or what a 4-degree scenario means? And just a side point on that, in the South African context, when we hear these words 2 degrees, 4 degrees, in the South African context, we must understand that climate risk isn't equal around the world, and the impact of climate change isn't equal. In the Southern African context, it's likely to be double. So when we hear the world talk around, let's try and achieve a 2-degree scenario, for South Africa, that means let's try and achieve a 4-degree scenario, just on the nature of how climate systems work within our continent. So going back to those 4 pillars around the governance, looking at the strategy, is it credible? What scenarios are you using? How robust is our risk management system? Can we pick up these signals? Do we understand how to manage them? And lastly, are our goals and targets credible? So are we setting goals that make sense? Are they based in science? Or are they just goals that we're just making because it looks nice? And then you run the risk of greenwashing. I think the last point that I just wanted to raise is that when we talk around climate risk, often it's viewed as something separate, something different, something that sits within an ESG portfolio, something that sits within the environmental community. I think it's clear that that's not the case. It's clear that it is transversal. It's going to impact, both of us, both in our personal lives, our day-to-day lives, our friends, our families, but also in the way in which you can and cannot do business, in the way that things might become more expensive, and how it impacts your balance sheet at the end of the day. So I think what's really important is that climate change is not viewed as something new or different. Yes, it's a complex system, but a lot of these risks will materialize within your existing risk categories. And I think it's important just to understand that it's another layer, it's another lens of how do we view and understand risk for our business. Yes, that is complex, and how you unpack that, and you can go down various levels of complexity. But what's important is that your approach to understanding that doesn't need to be complex, and that's where the TCFD provides a really helpful process to just begin. And the most important thing is that it's iterative, and Teresa and Sanjeeva both said that it's a journey, and we just need to make a start, and we need to move forward and understand, and in the next cycle you improve that and make better understanding of the real risks that you face within your business.
Thanks very much, Paul, and thanks to Sanjeev and Teresa. And I think it really paints a picture for us around, the urgency of the situation, the fact that this is happening. There's a lot of drivers, and I liked what you said, Paul, about how, and reiterating this point that Sanjeev had made about it being making business sense and using your existing frameworks, just bolting on a little bit, expanding that way that you look at risk. It's not something that is completely new. Assessing and identifying and assessing risk to your business should not be new to you. If it is, then your business was already in trouble, right? This process, this way of thinking is really important. It's just expanding that and allowing that to evolve and have a much more integrated approach to how you think about these things. And I liked your point as well about making that decision about, I know that there's a lot of information and there's a lot of data, but there's also a lot we don't know. And a lot of businesses that we will speak to have this attitude of, we don't know what will happen if we go down this road. And so we rather don't do anything, when actually the risk of inaction is probably far greater. So maybe Sanjeev, just to go back to you in terms of, you guys have made a lot of strides in identifying this risk and addressing it across particular value chains and within your operations directly. I mean, how does that kind of decision come about? Is it something that's driven by, do you just have the world's most progressive risk management team, or there's sort of a leadership top-down sort of passion project driving this kind of thing? How do you have that conversation for those participants here today that are sitting thinking, well, we've never even discussed this in a board meeting? How did that come about for you guys, and how do you get that conversation going in your organization?
I think there's a number of factors, and I don't think there's a single point that that one can put one's finger on. So to start with, in terms of governance, I mean, we report into the Social and Ethics Committee. I think the board is very supportive of these aspects, particularly around climate change. The executive team is also extremely supportive. In fact, for the first time this year, the executive team's remuneration will include non-financial indicators, non-financial sustainability indicators, representing at least 20% of their remuneration. So it's a kind of progression that we're seeing within the business. But I think what's important is to link it back to what is the purpose and what is the core of the organization. And that's why I started off with the ambition to be the most affordable and accessible and innovative retailer in Africa. Because whatever we do is directly linked into that, in how we can ensure we can have our consumers having access to products that are affordable. So I think that's very important. In terms of our journey, the group has been disclosing its climate change risks and opportunities on the CDP platform for the last 11 years. So it has a bit of momentum, it has a bit of history in that regard. And I think it's at a stage now, in fact, the last assessment was at a minus rating on CDP, which is important to mention because it's the highest rating a food retailer has in South Africa. But more so, it gives an idea in terms of what the progression and when we started the journey. You would know that CDP is very much aligned to TCFD, and I think there's a lot of commonality and a lot of overlap in that. But I think using these frameworks gives you a much closer view or understanding of what your risks and opportunities are currently, in the short term, and in the medium term, and in the long term. To give you an idea, for example, we talked about a bit around the carbon tax. In 2023, the carbon tax will start including electricity, and then that could become an aspect that will impact on the cost of electricity for businesses and for consumers. And again, impacting on our ambition to be the most affordable and accessible and innovative retailer in Africa. So important elements to take into consideration there. A 2-degree increase will also mean that our refrigeration systems have to work harder in a warmer climate. So in a food retailer, that means a lot in terms of energy consumption, the potential to increase wastage, which has a direct impact on your business. So when you start looking at these issues across your value chain, also in terms of your supplier, then it becomes very real and requires attention. I think the other thing we were able to do was to integrate, and Tarisha talked about it as well, was integrating our climate risks and opportunities into the enterprise risk model that we have, so that there's a better understanding internally around what the risks are and how we can mitigate them.
Great, thanks, Sanjeev. And I think it's really, I like the idea of having the sustainability indicators tied to executive remuneration, because we know that is one way to get action, to initiate action very quickly. There's been a question in the chat about whether you can expand a little bit on that in terms of what kinds of indicators are included in that kind of assessment.
Yeah, so there's three main indicators. It's our consumption of renewable energy. It's our recycling of plastic and cardboard. The group already recycles a significant amount of cardboard and plastic from its stores to its distribution centers. To give you an idea of scale, we recycle more than 40,000 tons of cardboard annually and 4,000 tons of plastic. And the intention is to increase that. And then the third one is around our commitments on sustainable packaging, where we're committing that by 2025, our packaging will be 100% reusable, recyclable, and compostable with the 30% recycled content.
Great, thank you. I think more on this idea of, it's Teresa, you mentioned it about sort of what gets measured, gets managed. One of the questions that's come through on the chat for you is, as a financial services institution, how do you decide what to measure? So what's like your metric to decide, are we doing well in terms of climate risk? Joe, I know Old Mutual is a massive machine, but maybe you can touch on some of the core indicators that you guys are using.
Yeah, definitely, Nicole. So I think, as Sanjeev mentioned, for us as well, CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, has also been sort of a long-standing commitment for us. And in terms of that, we do actually use the Greenhouse Gas Protocol in terms of aligning to that in relation to the relevant metrics disclosure. So considering it from the perspective of our portfolio holdings, we are primarily looking at carbon emissions as the primary metric, but then also looking to where there's potential to investigate opportunity-based metrics as well. So to what extent, I think, like you mentioned earlier, from a green finance taxonomy perspective, where you can actually classify your investments according to their contribution to the green economy. So that is something that we currently do and we currently measure, and is something that we would want to integrate into our overall climate change response.
Oh, that's great. And I think, one of the things that we've definitely seen in this space is that the measurability of indicators around the E part, the environmental, the sort of climate issues, is relatively straightforward, but it gets infinitely more complex when it comes to the S issues, right? So things like inequality or empowerment or poverty alleviation, or your contribution you'd mentioned, Sanjeev, around the SDGs, and how you attribute what you're doing to the achievement of things like that. So one of the questions that's come through is around how far your organizations are respectively on that kind of thinking and measuring progress in that regard, and what specifically, the main challenges around that kind of thing, and what might help it to become more sort of integrated and holistic when we look at that kind of reporting. Teresa, maybe you want to start, and then Sanjeev, your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's so critical, and for us, I think the appropriate response to that has been to actually consider the extent to which our governance and strategic frameworks are integrating holistic ESG considerations. So I did mention earlier, in terms of us having a responsible business framework in place. And through that, we have various responsible business pillars, which seek to address the E, the S, as well as the G. So we have a specific environmental pillar, but we also have pillars in relation to, for example, education or financial inclusion. And in that way, we seek to provide a sort of a holistic response that is actually premised on our Old Mutual Care's strategic pillars. So we can link that back to actual business outcomes and make it tangible for the ways in which each of our various business units operate.
Awesome. Thanks, Teresa. Sanjeev, your comments on sort of those indicators, and there's also a question that's come through for you about how do you address climate-related risks in transport and logistics in your value chain?
Yeah, I mean, your point is so important, and we're going to see the negotiations and the discussions in COP26 around a just and an equitable transition, and it's going to play out thereafter. Our approach, I guess, has been relatively, I wouldn't say simple, but when we look at community levels, I mean, our stores, our operations are based in the communities. We are part of the communities that we operate in, so we don't see ourselves as trading in communities, but rather in our communities. And when we look at adaptation, it's important not only for our business to be resilient and adaptive, but also for the communities that we are part of to have some level of resilience as well. So we embarked on a program of community and household food gardens quite a few years ago. And just to give you an idea of numbers, I mean, we have more than 150 community food gardens and more than 3,000 household gardens across South Africa, supporting thousands of people. And the intention and the thinking behind that is that by providing the facilities and the resources to grow food and support food security, then in that way, as we saw with COVID, communities can at least grow some food for themselves and for the neighbors in the communities that we operate. And like we saw, I mean, we have a fleet of mobile soup kitchens that we're able to deploy in any climate emergency, which gives some level of relief when these climate disasters strike, whether it's floods, whether it's fires, whether it's droughts. And like I indicated earlier, we know very well that is our lower income communities that are the most vulnerable when it comes to these climate related disasters. So yeah, just to round it off, I think a very important element when we talk about climate change is how we are supporting the communities that we are part of. And the second question I've forgotten already. So if you could just.
Oh, it was just about how can you address these risks when it comes to logistics and transport in your value chain?
Yeah, very important. I think our approach on logistics has always been, and our supply chain has always been around efficiencies and how we can improve efficiencies. Coming back to the earlier point about being efficient and reducing waste and losses so that we can be affordable. So there's a couple of things that we do on the transportation is we operate a centralized distribution model where we supply directly to our stores. So routing is very important. And that's one element where there's a significant amount of attention and energy, rather, let me say it like that, that goes into the routing of the vehicles when they're distributing or delivering to the stores. The elimination of dead loads is very important. So in that, we bring in elements of backhauling. So either from when the trucks are returning to the distribution centers, going via a supplier to get loaded and coming back to a distribution center. The other important part there is that we backhaul a lot of our plastic and cardboard waste back to our distribution centers where they can go on for recycling. And then very innovatively, we have solar panels on our refrigerated trailers. So in that way, the refrigerated trailers are able to keep its context and maintain its cold chain using solar panels, and so that the trucks itself don't have to run when it's parked or when it's traveling and consuming diesel then to drive those refrigeration units. So that's another element. I think we have more than 800 of our trailers on the road that are already fitted with solar panels to drive that.
Thanks, Sanjeev. So where there's a will, there's a way. There's always a solution if we care to think about it and investigate it. And I firmly believe, I'm an economist, so I have an unnatural sort of support for the efficiency of the market. So if you create demand, someone will supply it. I genuinely believe that. So if you say you want solar powered refrigeration trucks, somebody will find a way to make that real for you. One of the questions that's come through, which has been really interesting actually, is, can we not be more aggressive in some of these targets? Why are they all for like 2025 and 2030 and not for in the next 2 years? And if I can, I'd like to just have a stab at that before I hand over to Paul, which is really around, it really depends on the nature and scale of your operation. There's obviously ways, if you, for example, from a financial services perspective, if you want your portfolio to be carbon neutral tomorrow, you can do it, and it'll just be by divesting in everything. And then your portfolio will have nothing in it. But the truth of the matter is that these things take time. And because of the interconnectedness of issues and of systems and markets, it's not something that happens overnight. As you would have heard from Sanjeev and Trusha, there's different business lines, they have different supply chains, they have different impacts on consumers, they have different business models, and making changes to that is no small feat. It's another reason why it's important to start early, because you don't know how long it will take. These targets that we've got are ambitious in and of themselves, but need to be pragmatic in order for them to make any sense. We've seen all these increasing net zero by 2050 targets, for example. It sounds like it's a long time away, but if you are, as an example, one of the biggest pension funds in the world, making that shift in your portfolio takes a long time. Some of the investment commitments you've made are for 30 years. So you can't move for the next 3 decades. And so the only way you get there is over time. But the important thing is that we do start. It's possible to do these things more quickly when it comes to things like your direct operations, for example. If you've got the money and the will and you want to retrofit those in the short term, it's absolutely possible, but you need to always be thinking about whether that is sustainable in terms of keeping the business going in the long run as well. So it's a balance that needs to be addressed. I think from my side, it would be, you need to have ambitious targets, but they also need to be accompanied by pragmatic strategies for achieving them. And so that would be sort of a caution from my side, but maybe a good segue then to ask you, Paul, in our sort of last 5 minutes before we hand over to Vikeshni for a closing, is just what are some of the other maybe pitfalls that organizations need to be wary of if they decide, like, if this webinar has inspired them and they feel educated and empowered to get cracking on this, what do you think from your perspective is one of the big mistakes to try and avoid going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. And I think it builds on what you were saying, that yes, we can respond now and there's solutions in place. The global community understands the solutions, the technology is there, we know the destination, the key challenge is, what does that transition look like? And that's where the unknown sits. And it's not clear around how individual actors will respond that will change how you need to react. So I think what's really critical is that notion of a strategy. Is my strategy credible? Does it make sense? Is it based on some type of fact? And one of the ways to do that is engagement. So I think one of the first pitfalls is thinking that I'm alone in this world and I'm an island, I'm going to try and solve all the world's problems. No, it's a collaborative effort. There's a need for engagement, both internally within your internal stakeholders, within your business, but also externally, and really understand what are others doing that might derail those plans. For example, if I wanted to put in a big capital expenditure and improve my renewable energy. But what happens if the municipality is also thinking about that, and they know for their customers, they would like to provide them with renewable energy and have now made a commitment to procure renewable energy. That can solve some of your scope 2 challenges just through engagement and making sure that you understand how policies is changing, particularly at a local level government, where a lot of your actions are tied into how local government responds within their mandates. So if you think around urban planning, if you think around the physical risks, if the local municipality has an effective vulnerability assessment, understands where those flood lines are, and then is now developing ecological infrastructure or manufactured infrastructure to manage that, and now you go and make a big investment to manage that risk, and not through engaging, you haven't been able to pick that up. So I think one of the key pitfalls is not engaging. The other key sort of trap to avoid is this sort of short-termism. We have our blinkers on and we think, okay, I'm only in the business cycle of 5 years. What is the real risk in 5 years? And I think that, just reflecting on that, change has been happening. Somebody posted in the comment, the science has been known for over 100 years. Yes, it's been known for over 100 years what these gases do in our atmosphere. And we've known for 40 years, and the global community has said that we need to respond. So I think this sort of 5-year short-termism cycle, or making investments, on a day-to-day basis, doesn't impact. It does impact. You need to be able to pick up those signals, and obviously have that long-term view is important. And I think maybe the one other key aspect is pigeonholing, and I sort of mean that with climate change, a lot of people think it sits in the E, it sits within, the E of the ESG, it sits within somebody else's portfolio, it's a subcommittee, we don't have to worry about it, but that's not the case. And we've seen that it's transversal. We've spoken about the ES and the G. But I think another aspect of climate change that we haven't really sort of unpacked is the actual mental aspect of climate change. And there's a lot of research from the psychology community around what does climate change actually do to us psychologically, and how does that translate into physiological impacts? And I think when we think around the S, our social capital or our human capital, we're all impacted by climate change on a day-to-day basis, and that impacts your psyche and your ability to be productive in society. And there's a lot of research around what does heat mean, and there's some interesting research around heat and aggression, and how communities are responding, and what does heat stress actually mean within the community context. So it's important to note to not just put climate change as an E, but it is cross-cutting to everything that we do. And I think maybe this is the last point, I know you want to wrap up, Nicole, is that not acting is the biggest pitfall one can do. We need to do something, we need to make a start. If you're already doing things, that's great, let's look at them, let's improve them, let's interrogate them. If you're not acting, make a start, and there's plenty of ways to do that.
Thanks very much, Paul. And thank you very much to the other panelists, to Sanjeev and Terusha. I feel like we could speak for hours around what's going on. There was a question that came through that we're not going to have a chance to address, but if you wouldn't mind maybe dropping into the chat. There was just a question around your experience or your level of involvement with offsets. So whether you guys are looking at that or not. So if you could maybe drop into the chat. But for now, I thank you very much for your time and for your insights. A reminder that this is the first of 2 webinars, and the next one we're going to be looking even more at like sort of practical actions that companies are taking as well. But for now, my job is easy. It's to just final thank you to you and to introduce you to Vikeshni, who's going to be doing our wrap up for us and closing from IODSA's perspective. I thank everyone for their questions that they popped into the chat and the Q&A. We hope that you found the discussion valuable and that it was a useful and inspiring discussion for you so that you can get back to your office tomorrow and get started. Vikeshni, over to you for our closing. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. This was a very interesting and I think jam-packed session. I thought I could probably summarize some of the key pointers, but I think there's too many to mention. So from my perspective in closing, I think some of the takeaways I've taken is that this is a rapidly changing environment with very quick changing policies and an increased focus on the business requirements to address climate change risks. It has a direct impact on our risk and opportunity considerations. And what I've taken is that we need to take a very holistic approach to this in our strategies. And it definitely means that those who have not yet have it on the agenda of the board or your executive committees, it's definitely something that we need to start talking about and addressing how our organizations impact the society and environment in which we operate in. And like I mentioned, it definitely should be an agenda item and or one of the board committee agenda items. King 4 does already, cover it. Both in principle 3 and 4, it's looked at as an underpinning philosophy and concept. It links directly to the triple context discussions and considerations, our integrated thinking and reporting, and for the organization to be seen as a responsible corporate citizen. So it is part of our board's role and responsibilities and our good governance practices to put this on the agenda for us to consider and make sure we are actually making some impact to the potential risks that are going to be coming through. One of the aims or the main aim of the collaboration of this project with the Sustainability Institute and Trilogue was to create awareness on the subject itself, and to provide some of that capacity development that we saw from the results is lacking, and to also help boards and directors and the attendees that are here today to hopefully start the discussions in the boardroom or your executive committees, and to start looking at how your organization can approach this topic from its strategic perspective. There's been a number of thought leadership publications that have been produced, some of them mentioned by Jess and some mentioned by Nicole, as well as some in the chat group. Nick from Trilogue has said they will, in the email that they send out to the attendees with the recording, provide some of the links that Nicole mentioned around the tools and frameworks that were there in the results slide. So we will provide you with those links to make it easy for you. And you can also look at our IODSA publications library, where you can find a lot of some of the thought leadership that was mentioned here today as well, if you want to refer to that to help you in your discussions. Going forward, as you can see on your screen, we do have some more things to look forward to. This is part of a bigger project. The first survey looked at what's the current climate, how are directors thinking about climate change. We are going to have the COP conference. Following that, we will have a workshop with some of our designees to actually facilitate some of the results and some of the outcomes from the COP workshop. And then we will have another webinar on the 2nd of December to actually address the developments and agreements that come out of that conference and the workshop that we have. And then finally, there will be a research paper that will put all of these insights into something that you can then take away. So for me, as a very short and quick closing, I would really like to thank both our partners for today, for making this session a reality. Thank you to our panelists for their time, and Jess and Nicole for sharing these invaluable insights that they have. And thank you most importantly to our attendees that attended today. We look forward to you participating in the next surveys that come out, as well as the workshop, and hopefully seeing you in the next webinar to be held. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your week.